Senate Majority Leader Tom Bakk joins me now to talk about the Senate DFL budget targets. Senator, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Majority Leader, let's begin by encapsulating the targets, and how do you think they reflect on the Senate DFL's priorities?
Well, they're, the number one priority when we laid out our priorities at the start of the session was the passage of the healthcare exchange bill. The governor's going to sign that today. So that we've ticked off the list. Our second priority was all-day kindergarten. For every student in the state whose family wants it, the state will pay for it. That will be in our education bill. So, but I think largely you could say the Senate's budget proposal I think reflects the same priorities that we've seen come out of the governor's budget and out of the House, in that we're going to invest significant new money in our K-12 system, in our higher education system, and in property tax relief.
How much?
Well, we're actually going to be slightly over the governor and the House, very close to the House. The House invests a little bit more money in K-12 than the Senate does. The Senate invests a little bit more money in higher education than the House does, but we're not that far apart. But in education funding in general, K-12 and higher ed, we're pretty closely aligned between the House and the governor and the Senate.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about property tax relief, something that you've been a strong proponent of. What's in the plan? Well,
it's the place where the Senate is taking a little different course than both the House and the governor. We have significant property tax relief in the Senate tax bill. We're going to do our best to figure out how to restore some version of the state homestead credit that the Republicans took away in the current budget cycle. The other significant piece of property tax relief is actually going to be related to education funding. I have talked over the course of the session about my growing concern about the inequity in education funding across the state, as we've relied more and more on voter-approved operating levies. Some school districts have a lot of tax capacity, and it's relatively easy for them to pass voter-approved levies with new money per pupil. We've got some districts in the state that are bumping up against $2,000 per pupil of voter-approved levies at the local level. We have other districts, more than 40, who have no voter-approved levy at all, because for a number of reasons, tax capacity largely being it, they just can't seem to get a voter-approved referendum passed. So we're getting this disparity in districts. So one of the provisions in the education bill is to reduce the voter-approved levies by about $300 a pupil and move it around to a general education levy that the state would then equalize. So the state, depending on the amount of tax capacity a district has, the state would pay part of that $300 per pupil unit. So it really, in a small way, starts to restore the provisions of the Minnesota Miracle that was passed in 1971. And it's the place that the Senate is probably different from the House and the governor in the area of those levies. I have always felt we kind of get a twofer there. You get about $150 million of property tax relief in the Senate tax bill, just attributable to levies. And then that's replaced with $150 million of straight general fund money. So you get property tax relief and new general fund money to schools at the same time.
And talking about education, does your plan, my understanding at first blush is your plan does not include paying back the school shift. Is that an area that is open to negotiation for you?
Well, we're certainly willing to discuss that with the House. We didn't feel like we could provide the property tax relief that we wanted to and do the shift. And I think that's the same position they found themselves in, is they couldn't do the level of property tax relief that we were proposing and do the shift. They chose to do the shift to repay the shift. I don't disagree with them on that. It's just that we made a decision in the Senate to go more heavily towards property tax relief. I expect in the final conversation we'll talk about, you know, are we both maybe willing to, are we willing to scale back our property tax relief in the Senate, and is the House potentially willing to maybe reduce the acceleration of their paying back of the school shift? I think our spending levels are relatively close. They have to spend some additional money, raise some additional tax revenue because they're paying back the shift over a 2-year period. But I think our priorities are pretty closely aligned.
And your plan does include money for capital projects. What projects do you envision?
Well, the House has been talking all session about a large bonding bill. I'm not sure that we can accomplish that. You know, bonding bills normally happen in the even-numbered year, and the odd-numbered year is reserved for the budget and for emergency-type bonding. So we put some money in for capital. I think we called it the line capital bonding other, and we put about $100 million there. And our thought is that we could use some of that for debt service if we did a larger bonding bill. If the House cannot pass a bonding bill, and people need to remember, under the Constitution, bonding bills have to originate in the House, and they have to have a supermajority, 60% of the body vote for it. So it's going to require 8 Republicans to vote for the bonding bill in the House to get a bill. So rather than just put money in our budget for debt service on bonds, because we're unsure the House can actually deliver a bonding bill, we've put some cash there, because the one project that will need money coming out of this session, either in bonding or in cash, are the capital renovations. And I'm very excited about them. This building's over 100 years old. It's never had a facelift. It needs a massive amount of work. We appropriated about $44 million last year to start that renovations. If we don't put some additional money in this year, the renovations of the Capitol are going to come to a halt. And people are going to see scaffolding all over the building and no money to continue. So if the House is unable to get a bonding bill passed, we've put some cash in that we hope to then be able to appropriate to keep the renovations of the Capitol going through this biennium.
And you've been talking since session began about trying to seek some savings in HHS, and your budget plan shows a reduction in HHS funding even more than the governor's reductions. Where do you find these savings?
Well, we're actually coming in at about over $300 million in reduced spending in the HHS budget. We're spending, it's the area of our state budget where costs have just been running out of control. And it's because our population is aging. We've got more pressure on nursing homes, assisted living, on the cost of health care for vulnerable and disabled Minnesotans. So we're going to ask the Health and Human Service Committee to actually make real cuts. I mean, we're going to be about, the Senator's proposing that the real cuts, not a cut in the growth, a real cut from the base of about $153 million in the Health and Human Service budget in general fund spending. And we just have to get our arms around that. I remember when Governor Plenty used to say, you know, if we allow this inflation to just continue on in the state budget relative to Health and Human Services, that someday it's going to consume the entire state budget and there'll be no money left for anything else. So there are going to be some very, very difficult decisions made in the Health and Human Service Committee. But I think it's what Minnesotans expect us to do, make some really tough decisions, make some spending reductions, in addition to some new investments in things that Minnesotans support. And I think there's broad support for more money to K-12, higher ed, to property tax relief and job creation. And those are the priorities I think most Minnesotans share.
The governor took expanding sales tax off the table. However, he has moved his proposed sales tax of internet items into a different area of his budget. But what about you? You've been a proponent all along for expanding the sales tax base and lowering the rate, saying it would make it a less regressive, make our budget less regressive, or the instability part of it. So where does that stand?
Well, I think most tax analysts would tell you they support a progressive tax system, where the more revenue that you have as an individual, that the burden doesn't fall more heavily on low-income individuals. And so most people support a progressive system. Most tax systems, however, are regressive because of the nature of the sales tax and the property tax. And our system is no different. But ours is more progressive than most because we have a lot of reliance on income taxes.
Do you have sales tax in your plan?
Well, the problem with the income tax is it's also a very volatile revenue stream. So we go through these wild revenue swings. It's hard to keep a state budget in balance as the economy goes through its ups and downs. So we're working in the Senate in our tax bill potentially to put some additional sales tax provisions in, but we would not spend the money. I think the direction Senator Skoye is going right now is we're looking at kind of a menu of different sales tax items, much of which the governor considered and then decided not to do. But our plan would not be to spend any money. Our plan would be, to the extent we can expand the sales tax to some things, we will reduce the rate.
But not a blanket expansion.
We will, no. We're going to try and pick some items that we think won't do any damage to our economic recovery, and then lower the rate by a corresponding amount. But I don't know how much that will be. It depends on, you know, kind of what the caucus's appetite is. I know the governor's feeling some anxiety about the sales tax. He got beat up pretty hard for his broad reform proposal, and I mean, I give him a lot of credit for having a lot of courage. I mean, governors going back all the way to Perpich have talked about tax reform, how important it is to put some stability in our revenue system, and the governor released a very bold plan. And I think people didn't give him the consideration that he should have gotten for that. I mean, lowering the sales tax rate to 5.5% on everything you buy would have been tremendous tax reform, put huge new stability in our system. But unfortunately, the governor just got so much heat that he made a decision that he wasn't going to continue to go forward with it. So in the Senate, to some small extent, not as broad as what he had proposed, but to a smaller extent, we're going to continue to talk about sales tax reform that potentially lowers the rate. I don't know exactly what it'll look like yet, but the issue's not dead in the Senate.
Okay, Mr. Majority Leader, as always, thanks for coming in and detailing this plan. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.